Some people don't come back to hurt you. They come back to show you who you really were. The glass slipped from Emily Carter's hand, a thin crack echoing across the quiet diner. But before it could shatter, a hand caught it midair, steady, controlled, familiar. And for a second, time stopped as Daniel Hayes looked up, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and memory, because standing in front of him, in a simple white shirt and worn apron, was the woman he had buried in his past, the woman he once called his wife. And now she was here, pregnant, quiet, composed, as if the years between them had never existed. Yet everything had changed, the soft hum of the diner fading into silence as his world narrowed to her, to the curve of her stomach, to the absence of the life they once planned, his voice low, almost unrecognizable even to himself. Emily. But she didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't even look surprised, just placed the glass gently on the table and reached for her notepad like he was any other customer, like the man who had once promised her forever was. Now just a name on a receipt. What can I get you, sir? Her tone steady, professional, distant, and that distance cut deeper than anything he could have imagined, because Emily had always been soft, warm, the kind of woman who filled silence with kindness. But this version of her was different, stronger, quieter, as if life had carved something unbreakable into her. Daniel swallowed, his eyes dropping again, drawn back to the truth he couldn't ignore, calculating weeks, months, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into the narrative he had believed for so long. How far along are you? The question slipped out before he could stop it, raw, unfiltered, and for the first time, her hand paused, just for a second, before continuing to write. Is there anything else you'd like to order? She asked instead, ignoring the question entirely, and that silence, that refusal, spoke louder than any accusation ever could. Around them, the world moved on, plates clinked, a door chimed, someone laughed. But at that table, everything felt suspended, unresolved, like a story that had ended too soon. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Is it mine? And this time, she looked at him, really looked. Her eyes calm, but carrying something deeper, something he couldn't read, not anger, not sadness, just clarity. And when she spoke, it was quiet, almost gentle. You already chose what to believe, she said, placing the check on the table between them like a final line drawn in ink. And in that moment, Daniel felt something shift, something crack beneath the surface of everything he thought he knew. Because the woman in front of him wasn't asking for anything, wasn't explaining, wasn't defending herself. She was simply standing there, holding her dignity like armor. And for the first time, Daniel Hayes, the man who controlled billion-dollar deals and never questioned his own judgment, realized there might be a truth he had never seen, a truth that had been waiting, silent, all along. Daniel did not remember leaving the diner, but somehow he was already in the back seat of his car, the city lights blurring past the window like a timeline he could not rewind, his fingers still resting on the receipt she had placed in front of him, the ink slightly smudged where her hand had touched it, as if that was the only proof she had been real, as if the woman he had just seen could not possibly be the same Emily Carter who once laughed too easily and believed in things he had long stopped believing in. His jaw tightened as he closed his eyes, but her voice would not leave, calm, steady, distant. You already chose what to believe. The words echoing louder the more he tried to silence them, because he had chosen, years ago, in that cold office filled with accusations and documents and a single message that had shattered everything, a message that told him she had betrayed him, that she had taken something that was never hers, that she had walked away without explanation. And he had believed it. He had believed it because it was easier than asking questions, easier than facing the possibility that he might be wrong. The car slowed to a stop, but Daniel did not move, his mind already somewhere else, back in that moment when he had signed the papers, when he had let her leave without a fight, without even looking into her eyes, and now those same eyes had looked at him with something he could not understand. Not regret, not anger, just distance, as if she had already moved beyond anything he could offer. His phone buzzed, pulling him back, a message from his assistant reminding him of a meeting in the morning, a deal worth hundreds of millions, something that once would have consumed all of his attention, but now felt strangely insignificant. He unlocked the screen, hesitated, then opened a folder he had not touched in years, the one labeled with a single name. Emily. Inside were files, reports, the evidence he had relied on to justify everything. His thumb hovered for a second before opening the first document. The numbers, the transactions, the accusations, all laid out in cold precision. But something felt off, something he had never noticed before, a timestamp that did not align, a signature that looked slightly different. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, the city fading away completely now, replaced by a growing unease that settled deep in his chest. Because for the first time, he was not looking for confirmation, he was looking for truth, and the more he read, the more the foundation of everything he believed began to crack, the pieces no longer fitting the way they once had, a quiet realization forming, slow but undeniable, that maybe Emily had not been the one who walked away. Maybe she had been the one pushed, and as that thought settled in, heavier than anything he had carried before, Daniel Hayes understood something he had never allowed himself to consider, that the story he built, his life on, might have been a lie. The office was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock Daniel had never noticed before, a slow, steady rhythm that now felt louder with every second as he sat behind his desk, the same desk where he had once signed the papers that ended his marriage, his fingers scrolling through the files again, slower this time, more careful, as if the truth might disappear if he moved too quickly. And then he saw it, not in the numbers, not in the transactions, but in something smaller, almost invisible, a forwarded email chain with a timestamp that did not match the original report. His breath tightened as he opened it, his eyes scanning line by line, the language too precise, too deliberate, as if someone had crafted it to be believed without question. And at the bottom, a name he had trusted without hesitation, Victor Lang, his former financial advisor, the man who had stood beside him during the investigation, the man who had told him, with quiet certainty, that Emily had betrayed him. Daniel leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under the shift of weight as a cold realization settled over him, not sudden, not explosive, but heavy, undeniable, like a door opening to a room he had refused to enter for years. Because if this was wrong, if this had been manipulated, then everything he had done, every decision, every word he had spoken to her, had been built on something false. His jaw tightened as he reached for his phone, dialing a number he had not called in a long time. The line rang twice before a voice answered, calm, familiar. Mr. Hayes, it has been a while, Victor said, his tone smooth, controlled, exactly as Daniel remembered. I need to ask you something, Daniel replied, his voice steady but lower than usual, carrying something new, something sharper. About the Carter file. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, but enough for Daniel to notice, enough for doubt to turn into certainty. That was closed years ago, Victor said, lightly, as if it meant nothing. It should stay that way. Daniel's eyes drifted to the window, to the reflection staring back at him, a man who had built his empire on precision, on knowing every detail, and yet had missed the one thing that mattered most. Walk me through it. Again, he said, and this time, his tone left no room for deflection. Another pause, longer now, the kind that carried weight. There is nothing more to explain, Victor answered, but something in his voice had shifted, barely noticeable, but real, and Daniel felt it. The same way he had felt the inconsistency in the documents, the same way he had felt the distance in Emily's eyes, and suddenly, everything aligned, not clearly, not completely, but enough to form a direction, enough to tell him that the story he had accepted was incomplete, that there were pieces missing, and that someone had made sure he would never look for them. He ended the call without another word, the silence in the office returning, heavier now, filled with something that had not been there before, responsibility, not the kind measured in contracts or numbers, but something deeper, something personal, because if Emily had not betrayed him, then she had left for a reason. And if she had left without fighting, without explaining, then maybe she had been protecting something, or someone. His mind flashed back to the diner, to the way she stood, calm, unshaken, carrying a strength that did not come from nowhere, and then to the child she carried, the question he had asked echoing again, unanswered, and for the first time, Daniel did not feel entitled to that answer. He felt unworthy of it. He stood up abruptly, the chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the floor, his decision forming not as a plan, but as a necessity. He needed the truth, not for the deal waiting in the morning, not for the company, but for the woman he had once walked away from without looking back. And as he reached for his coat, one thought remained, quiet but relentless. If Emily had been telling the truth all along, then the real question was not why she left, but why he had never stayed long enough to listen. The rain had started by the time Daniel stepped out of the building, a steady, quiet fall that blurred the city into streaks of gray and gold. But he did not slow down, did not wait for the driver to open the door, instead walking straight into it, as if the cold could sharpen the thoughts racing through his mind. Because for the first time in years, he was not thinking about numbers or negotiations. He was thinking about Emily, about the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with longing, but with a calm distance that suggested she had already made peace with something he was only beginning to understand. The car pulled up beside him, but he waved it off, his voice low. "I will handle this myself." And moments later he was behind the wheel, the engine starting with a quiet hum as he drove back toward the diner. The same place he had left only hours ago, but everything felt different now. Heavier, more urgent, as if time itself had shifted, the streets familiar but distant, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as fragments of memory surfaced uninvited. Emily standing in their old kitchen, sunlight catching in her hair, her voice soft as she tried to explain something he had not wanted to hear. And then the echo of his own voice, cold, final, cutting her off before she could finish. He had not just believed a lie, he had refused the truth. The realization settled deeper with every mile, until the diner came into view, its neon sign flickering faintly against the rain. Daniel parked quickly, stepping out without hesitation, his eyes scanning the windows, searching for her, for any sign that he had not imagined at all. Inside, the diner looked the same, quiet, ordinary, the hum of conversation and the clink of dishes filling the air. But she was not there, not at the counter, not among the tables. A different waitress approached him with a polite smile. "Table for one?" she asked, but Daniel shook his head, his gaze still moving, restless. "Emily," he said, the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue after all this time. "Is she here?" The waitress hesitated for a moment, then glanced toward the back. "She finished her shift early," she replied, her tone casual, unaware of the weight behind the question. "She does that sometimes." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic, not yet, but something close, something that told him he was already too late. "Do you know where she went?" he asked, and this time there was a slight shake of the head. "No, sir, she keeps to herself." The answer was simple, but it landed harder than he expected, because of course she did. Emily had always been private, careful with her world, and now he realized just how little he knew about the life she had built without him. He stood there for a moment longer, the noise of the diner fading again as the truth settled in. She was not waiting for him. She had not been waiting all these years. Whatever she had endured, whatever choices she had made, she had done it alone, without asking him for anything. And that realization stripped away the last illusion he had held on to, that he could simply walk back into her life and ask for answers. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, as Daniel stepped back onto the street, his eyes lifting to the dim light of the diner's sign, then lowering to his hand, still holding the receipt she had given him, the paper now slightly damp, the ink beginning to blur, but one detail remained clear, a small line at the bottom he had not noticed before, written in her handwriting, not part of the bill, just a quiet addition, almost easy to miss, an address, and beneath it, a time, tomorrow, 8 a.m., and for the first time since he had seen her again, Daniel did not feel lost. He felt directed, not by control, not by certainty, but by something far more unfamiliar, a chance. And as he folded the receipt carefully, placing it into his coat pocket like something fragile, something earned, one thought stayed with him, quiet but undeniable, that Emily Carter had not disappeared. She had simply chosen when, and if, he would be allowed to find her. Morning arrived without ceremony, the sky pale and quiet as if the city itself had not yet decided what the day would become. But Daniel was already awake, already dressed, standing outside the address written on the receipt. A modest brick building tucked between a pharmacy and a small grocery store. Nothing like the glass towers he was used to, nothing that reflected power or status. Just something real, something lived in. And for a moment, he did not move, his hand resting in his coat pocket where the folded receipt remained, as if crossing that threshold would mean stepping into a version of truth he could no longer avoid. A door opened before he could decide, and there she was, Emily, standing in the doorway as if she had known the exact second he would arrive, her expression calm, unreadable, the morning light soft against her face, and again, she did not look surprised. "You are early," she said quietly, stepping aside just enough to let him in, not inviting, not rejecting, simply allowing. Daniel entered slowly, his eyes adjusting to the space. A small apartment, clean but simple, a couch worn at the edges, a table with a single chair, a folded blanket draped neatly. Everything intentional, everything measured, as if nothing existed here that was not necessary. And then he noticed the details that mattered. A small pair of baby's shoes placed carefully near the wall, a stack of medical papers on the table, a half-finished cup of tea gone cold, signs of a life built in quiet persistence. Without help, without him. "You found the address," she said, closing the door behind him, her voice steady. And he turned to face her, the questions pressing forward but held back by something unfamiliar. Restraint. "You wrote it," he replied, and she gave a slight nod, as if that alone explained everything. A silence followed, not empty, but full of years unspoken, of choices made without explanation, of moments that could not be undone. Daniel glanced around once more, taking in the space, the absence of anything extravagant, the presence of everything essential, and then his eyes returned to her, softer now, less certain. "Why here?" he asked, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression, not weakness, but something closer to honesty. "Because this is where my life is," she answered simply, and the weight of those words settled between them. Because her life had continued, with or without him, and he had not been part of it, not by accident, but by choice, his choice. Daniel stepped forward slightly, careful, as if approaching something fragile. "Emily, I read the files again," he began, his voice lower, more deliberate. "Something does not add up." She watched him without interrupting, without reacting, just listening, the way she always had. But this time, there was distance in it, a boundary he could feel but not cross. "It was altered," he continued. "The evidence, the timeline, someone changed it." A pause. Then, "Victor." Her gaze dropped briefly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, as if she had already known, as if she had been carrying that truth alone all this time. "Yes," she said softly, and that single word held more weight than any explanation. Daniel exhaled slowly, the realization no longer forming, but fully present now, undeniable. "Then why did you not tell me?" The question came out quieter than he expected, not accusing, but searching, and this time, she did not answer immediately, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, her fingers tracing the edge as if grounding herself, before she looked back at him, her eyes clear, steady. "Because you had already decided who I was," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just truth, simple and complete. And in that moment, Daniel understood something that no report, no investigation could ever show him, that the biggest mistake he had made was not believing a lie, it was choosing not to listen when the truth had been standing right in front of him all along. The room felt smaller after her words, not because the space had changed, but because the truth had settled into it, quiet and undeniable, and Daniel stood there, the weight of it pressing against everything he thought he understood about control, about certainty, about being right. His eyes lowering briefly before returning to her, softer now, stripped of the confidence that once defined him. "I should have listened," he said, the sentence simple, but heavier than any apology he could have offered. Emily did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, not cold, not forgiving, just present, as if she was measuring not his words, but what stood behind them. And for the first time, Daniel did not try to fill the silence. He let it remain, uncomfortable, necessary, because he understood now that silence had always been where the truth lived, not in the arguments, not in the accusations. But in the moments he had chosen to ignore, his eyes drifted toward the table again, to the stack of papers he had noticed earlier, and without asking, he stepped closer, careful, almost hesitant, as if crossing into a part of her life he had not earned the right to see. The top page revealed a series of medical notes, appointment dates, measurements, everything precise, everything real, and his chest tightened as the reality settled deeper. This was not just a possibility, not just a question. This was a life, a future that had been unfolding without him. "How long have you known?" he asked. Quietly, his voice carrying something unfamiliar, not authority, but vulnerability. Emily followed his gaze, then answered without hesitation. "Long enough to understand I had to do this on my own." And again, there was no bitterness, no attempt to make him feel guilty, just a statement of fact, and somehow that made it harder to hear, because she was not trying to punish him. She had simply adapted to a world where he was not there. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the motion slower than usual, as if even that required thought now. "You should not have had to," he said, and this time, she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she replied softly. "I should not have." The agreement hung between them, not as blame, but as truth, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet stretching, filled with everything that had been lost and everything that could not be undone. Daniel's gaze returned to her, more focused now, more certain, but not in the way it once had been. This certainty was different, grounded not in control, but in understanding. "I am going to fix this," he said, not as a command, not as a promise meant to impress, but as something he owed. To her, to himself. Emily studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching, not for confidence, but for sincerity, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but carried a quiet boundary. "You cannot fix the past," she said, and he nodded slowly, accepting it without resistance. "No," he replied, "but I can stop pretending it was right." And that, more than anything else he had said, seemed to reach her, not in a way that changed everything, but in a way that shifted something small, something subtle, like the first crack in a wall built over years. She looked away then, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, a gesture so natural, so instinctive, that Daniel felt it more than he saw it. And in that moment, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by him, not by his wealth, not by his influence, but by her, by the woman who had quietly carried the weight of his absence and still stood there with dignity intact. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Hayes realized that earning a place in someone's life was not about power. It was about patience, about truth, and about proving, step by step, that he was no longer the man who walked away without listening. Daniel did not leave right away, even after the conversation settled into silence again, because something had shifted inside him, something that would not let him return to the version of his life that existed before he walked through that door. His eyes moved once more around the apartment, slower this time, noticing what he had missed before, the small calendar on the wall with certain dates circled in pen, the grocery list written neatly beside it, the absence of anything unnecessary, everything reduced to what mattered, and he understood then that Emily had not just survived, she had rebuilt, piece by piece, without asking anyone to notice, without asking him to return. "You kept everything simple," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and she followed his gaze briefly before answering. "Simple is easier when you only rely on yourself." The words were not sharp, not meant to wound, but they landed with a quiet precision that made him pause, because they were true, completely and entirely true. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, not arguing, not defending, just accepting, and that acceptance changed the way he stood there, less like someone trying to reclaim something, more like someone trying to understand what he had lost. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, persistent, insistent, the world outside reminding him of responsibilities waiting, deals pending, people expecting him to show up as the man he had always been. But he did not reach for it, not yet, because for once, that world felt distant, secondary to the one standing in front of him. "I have a meeting this morning," he said after a moment, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "A big one." Emily gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something obvious. "You should not miss it," she replied, And there was no irony in her tone, no attempt to challenge him, just a simple truth, because she knew exactly who he was and what his life required, and that knowledge, that calm understanding, made it even harder to stand there, because she was not asking him to choose. She was simply letting him reveal what he would choose on his own. Daniel looked at her for a long second, the question forming not in words, but in the space between them, the kind of question that did not need to be spoken, and she met his gaze without hesitation, without expectation, and in that moment, he understood that whatever came next would not be proven by what he said, but by what he did. His hand finally moved to his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls, messages stacked one after another, his assistant, his partners, the meeting already beginning without him. His thumb hovered over the screen, a familiar instinct urging him to respond, to take control, to return to the structure that had always defined him. But then he glanced back at Emily, at the quiet strength in her posture, at the life she had built in his absence. And for the first time, he made a different choice. His thumb moved, not to answer, but to silence the notifications, the screen going dark as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They will manage," he said simply. And it was not arrogance, not dismissal, just a quiet shift in priority. Emily watched him closely, and for the first time since he had arrived, something in her expression softened, just slightly, not enough to be called forgiveness, but enough to be noticed, enough to suggest that this moment mattered, that this choice, small as it seemed, was not invisible to her. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not because everything was resolved, but because for once, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was simply present. "I do not expect you to trust me," he said, his voice steady, grounded. "Not yet." And she gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth. In that, because trust was not something that could be asked for, it was something that had to be rebuilt, slowly, carefully. And as the quiet filled the room again, it no longer felt heavy. It felt like a beginning, fragile, uncertain, but real. And in that stillness, Daniel Hayes realized that for the first time in his life, he was not trying to win, he was trying to be worthy. The hours that followed did not feel like progress. They felt like exposure, like layers being slowly peeled back from a truth Daniel had avoided for years. And by the time he stepped out of Emily's apartment, the morning had fully arrived, the streets busier now, people moving with purpose, unaware that for him, everything had shifted, his car still waiting where he had left it, but he did not get in right away, instead standing there for a moment, the cool air grounding him, reminding him that this was real, that Emily was real, that the child she carried was real, and that none of it could be reduced to a mistake or misunderstanding anymore. He finally reached for his phone, not with hesitation this time, but with clarity, scrolling past the missed calls until he found the one name that mattered, Victor Lang, his thumb pressing the call button without delay. The line connected almost instantly, as if the man had been expecting it. "Daniel." Victor's voice came through, smooth as ever, controlled. "I assume you have reconsidered revisiting old matters." But Daniel did not respond the way he once would have, did not allow the tone to guide the conversation. "I saw the original files," he said instead, direct, leaving no space for interpretation. There was a pause, longer this time, and when Victor spoke again, something subtle had shifted. "Those records were handled appropriately," he replied, carefully, but Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "No," he said, calm, firm. "They were altered." Silence followed, not empty, but heavy, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. And in that silence, Daniel understood everything he needed to, not through confession, but through absence, through the lack of denial, through the careful choice of words that avoided truth. "Why?" Daniel asked. And this time, the question carried weight, not just curiosity, but consequence. Another pause. Then Victor exhaled softly. "You were expanding too quickly," he said, his voice measured, almost reasonable. "There were risks, uncertainties, and she was not aligned with the direction we needed." Daniel's grip tightened slightly around the phone, not in anger, but in realization. Because this was not about misunderstanding. This had been a decision, calculated, deliberate. "So, you removed her," Daniel said quietly, and Victor did not correct him, did not argue, the silence again speaking louder than anything else. And in that moment, the final piece settled into place, not with shock, not with disbelief, but with a quiet certainty that made everything else clear. Emily had not left because she was guilty. She had left because she was pushed out of a world that chose convenience over truth. And Daniel had allowed it to happen, not because he was forced, but because he had trusted the wrong person, believed the easier version of events, the one that required no effort to understand. He ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. A man who had built his life on control, now standing in the aftermath of a decision he never fully questioned. The city moved around him, unchanged, but he felt different, not broken, not defeated, just aware of what had been taken and what could never be returned to the way it was. His eyes lifted back toward the building, toward the window he had just left, and for a moment, he simply stood there, not planning, not calculating, just present in the weight of what he now knew. Because fixing the truth was not the same as fixing the damage. And as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, one thought remained, quiet but steady, that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming the past. It would be about proving, without words, that he understood it. The next few days did not come with dramatic changes or sudden resolutions. They came quietly, almost unnoticed, like the slow shift of light across a room. And Daniel allowed them to unfold without forcing direction, without trying to accelerate something that could not be rushed. He returned to his office, but not as the same man who had left it. The files on his desk no longer just numbers and projections, but reminders of decisions that carried consequences beyond profit. And one by one, he began to correct what he could, not loudly, not publicly, but precisely, removing Victor from every position of influence, reopening internal audits, restoring records that had been altered, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge it. And for once, he did not measure success by speed, but by accuracy, by truth. And when the workday ended, he found himself not drawn to boardrooms or late dinners, but back to the same small street where Emily lived. Not every day, not intrusively, just enough to show presence without pressure. Sometimes he would bring groceries, simple things, fresh fruit, basic essentials, leaving them at her door without knocking, not as a gesture to impress, but as something practical, something useful. And sometimes she would accept them, sometimes she would not, and he respected both responses equally, because this was not about earning gratitude, it was about consistency, about showing up in ways that did not demand anything in return. Weeks passed, and the distance between them did not disappear, but it changed, softened at the edges. Conversations became slightly longer, less guarded, not because everything had been forgiven, but because something new was being built, slowly, carefully. And one afternoon, as the sun filtered through the window of her apartment, Emily stood near the table, reviewing a set of medical papers, her expression focused, thoughtful, and Daniel, sitting quietly nearby, noticed the slight tension in her posture, the way her hand lingered on one page longer than the others. "Is everything okay?" he asked, not stepping closer, not assuming, just asking, and she hesitated for a moment before answering. "It is routine," she said, but her voice carried something more, something unspoken, and for a second, he considered letting it go, respecting her space, but then he remembered the cost of silence. The years built on things left unsaid, and this time, he chose differently. "If there is something you want to share, I am here," he said quietly, and the words did not sound like an offer. They sounded like a commitment, and she looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring not just the sentence, but the man who spoke it. And after a moment, she handed him the paper, a small gesture, but one that carried weight. And as Daniel took it, his eyes scanning the details, understanding forming. Slowly, carefully, he realized that this was not just about the past anymore. It was about the future, about a life that would soon exist beyond both of them. And in that realization, something shifted again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, grounded, like a foundation finally set in place. He looked back up at her, his voice calm, certain. "We will figure this out," he said, not as a declaration of control, but as a shared possibility. and she did not immediately agree, did not offer reassurance, but she did not turn away either. And that, in itself, was enough, because for the first time, they were not standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding. They were standing in the same space, facing something real, together, and as the quiet settled around them once more, it no longer felt like distance. It felt like trust beginning to take shape, not fully formed, not guaranteed, but present. And in that stillness, one truth remained, simple and enduring, that sometimes the strongest form of redemption is not in grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to stay, to listen, and to never walk away again.